All right. Hi. Wow, the place filled up. So my name is Kevin Paterson. I'll start by telling you my unique war story, as I call it. So growing up, I had many dreams. One of them, I always expected that I would get married in my early 20s. But the years passed. I graduated from university, started a business, held a career as a journalist and as a teacher, traveled as a missionary, taught in a Bible training center, but still, I was single. People often said to me, "You're a great guy, you love God, you're traveling the world over, as part of a ministry, you're meeting all these great Christians, you're bound to find an amazing wife." Yep, but it wasn't happening. My 20s became my 30s and eventually my 40s. What my optimistic friends didn't take into account was the dysfunction and brokenness of the culture, the church, singles, and me. Along the way, massive frustrations as dozens of potential great relationships fell apart for various reasons. Either there were serious misunderstandings, I lost interest, she lost interest, one of us decided it wasn't worth the work, or likely there were just many unrealistic expectations. In the midst of excruciating loneliness, sometimes I would literally cry myself to sleep, longing for a close companion for life. But that crazy hazardous battle took me into my late 40s. Sure, there were lots of joys and highlights of being single. The many socials, mission trips, pleasures, freedoms, and adventures of the single life. And through much prayerful study of relationships and the Word, I learned lots and was able to help a lot of my single friends find their spouse. In fact, many of my roommates, as I counseled them, prayed for them, or even set them up, were soon married. And eventually, it was my turn. So 7 wonderful years ago, my bride's in the second row here, I returned from a missions trip and found a match on a dating site to be very intriguing. Yes, we are a contemporary couple that believes that God can even work through technology to match people. We discovered that we both had a multicultural background, we both had taught English, we had a passion for God, and had worked for an evangelistic organization. And amazingly, we both had friends in Canada who knew each other. So, of course, as we began to court, our friends began to compare notes about us, and it was an interesting journey. Fortunately, I had some great prayer partners that helped me through my older single guy jitters. Basically, they started to threaten that they would stop praying for a wife for me if I didn't get on with it, and seal the deal with this amazing woman. So after a year of long-distance communicating and commuting, my bride and I each married for the first time in an amazing ceremony at the San Jose Rose Garden. So why am I telling you my story? Well, because it's not just my story. It's the story of millions of singles the world over, often without the happy ending. Like most singles, I wanted to get married, but I just didn't know how to get there. And in the church, it just seemed like there was nobody there who could really help me on the way. So here's what I'll focus on for the rest of the talk. Transforming a dysfunctional singles culture, or maybe just cultural in general. I want to share some lessons that I learned while helping Christians overcome on the relational journey, as I call it, from "Hi, how are you?" to "Yes, I do." Today there are millions of long-term single or single-again Christians. They're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. Perhaps you're one of them. Or you know a single Christian also with a similar frustrating relational journey. There are all kinds of signs of a crisis in our culture. Recent statistics show that single adults now outnumber married adults in America. Some commentators are now calling America the singles nation. Single adults include the divorced, widowed, single parents, and the never married. Compared to 9% of singles never married in 1960, researchers today predict that about 25% of millennials will never marry. Trends of singleness in the church seem to closely reflect what's happening in the world. In fact, some U.S. churches have single adult populations as high as 70% or more of their congregation. That's why my wife and I have devoted the last 5 years to ministering to the most forgotten group of people in the Christian culture, single Christian adults. In our family and marriage-focused church system, pastors and leaders often just aren't sure how to minister to singles. And singles pastors, as you probably know, are often the first to go in a budget crunch. Here's another symptom of our crisis. In my experience, tragically, if you ask most Christian singles to be completely honest with you, 95% of them or more will tell you they want to be married someday, or they did want to be married. So no, they aren't feeling a call to celibacy. This long, frustrating trend of prolonged singleness has become a quiet crisis in the church. Then there's this. Renowned Christian speaker, I'll back up. Renowned Christian speaker Josh McDowell says that from decades of experience with youth, he believes that, I'm going to go back to that slide there. Okay. In a recent New York Times article, researchers described America as experiencing what they call an epidemic of loneliness. Other studies show that the percentage of Americans that say they regularly feel lonely has grown from 11% in the 70s to over 40% today in 2010, I think the stats show. This includes singles, many of whom live alone or live a very isolated lifestyle. And unfortunately, like McDonald's, social media can temporarily satisfy, but it still leaves people relationally malnourished. So we have what I call a perfect cultural storm. Here I'm going to share or focus just on 4 of many factors that are converging in this storm against relationships, in kind of a perfect cultural storm. If you remember the movie, you have that image in your mind. Here's one of them. First of all, we believe that our spiritual enemy knows that healthy marriages have the power to destroy his evil kingdom. If he can't destroy marriages, he'd like to prevent them from even happening. Also, the wounds of fatherlessness or poor fathering have wreaked havoc in our culture. Sociologists call this the fatherless generation. The damage started with men and fathers involved in the many wars over the years. Tens of millions of men were either killed or wounded, physically or emotionally, often leaving children fatherless in one form or another. Men returned to the U.S. Suffering from emotional traumas that left children hurt, neglected, or abused. That damage has infiltrated our culture and the media throughout the generations. A renowned Christian speaker, Josh McDowell, says that from his decades of experience with youth, 95% of our social ills today, whether it's crime, addiction, unwed mothers, or whatever, are connected to poor fathering or lack of fathering. And so that contributes to a number of factors. Experts tell us this deficit of healthy fathering without the needed affection, mentoring, quality time, and unconditional love can greatly erode self-confidence and the worth of children, or, of course, the adults that they grow into. Father wounds can also cause children, teens, and eventually adults to isolate from people, which erodes social skills. And then, lack of fathering often leaves children feeling the void of that special love for the rest of their lives. This empty love tank leaves them unable to give and receive the love that's necessary for a healthy relationship. I'm sure you can see how this path leads to fear of rejection, emotional isolation, and then, of course, Christian singles that start to doubt that God cares about them and their relational needs. Another force in this cultural storm is what I call destructive media parenting. In this me generation, we have a society teaching us to look out for number one. We're bombarded with messages telling us we need to satisfy every material desire. Singles often apply the same value system to creating spouse shopping lists. So this, as you can imagine, encourages the exact opposite of biblical self-sacrificial love needed to make relationships work. Then there's Hollywood brainwashing. Hollywood and the media repeatedly reinforce a high value for certain ideal traits, like physical attractiveness, charm, wild spontaneity, romance, etc. We found that singles often, because of this, build their own Christian mental avatar of their future spouse. So the gals are looking for a Brad Pitt, Jesus hybrid boyfriend. The guys are looking for an Angelina Jolie, Mother Teresa wife. And so clearly, these idealistic images dramatically narrow their options, right? Not a whole lot of people like that out there. And then, back up. Our culture has perpetrated a number of beliefs about finding a date or a spouse that even Christian singles have adopted. The strongest and most destructive we found is the idea that you have to find the one, that perfect, ideal person that God created out there in the world somewhere there just for you. Instead, we encourage singles to partner with God in making wise, healthy choices instead of looking for the one. You can check out my video blog to find out why the one myth is definitely not scriptural. Another wrong mindset we see is the emphasis on having chemistry or feelings right away, instead of cultivating loving feelings and connection over time. Also, many singles tend to believe that if it's too hard, it just can't be right. In reality, the opposite is often the case. Relationships are just hard work, and bringing two lives together means working through challenging issues. So here's a fourth negative force: relational wounds. So just as father wounds can hinder singles' relational lives, so too can all kinds of family hurts, including divorce, which is now at record levels. And in this dysfunctional, commitment-breaking culture, Christian singles can experience years of relational wounds and dating breakups. They also regularly encounter people who don't keep their word and who replace their friends more often than their iPhones. Then there's, of course, the splits and spiritual abuse in the church. And then we wonder why Christian singles fear and avoid deep, meaningful relationships. This may seem like a bleak picture I'm painting. So, let's talk about God's restoration plan. Strategies for Christian single adults desiring marriage. Now, of course, this normally takes us 4 days in 4 workshops we do, but I'm going to compress it into a few minutes. First of all, unfortunately, in our culture, people, even Christians, can prioritize career, success, pleasure, and a dozen other things over relationships. But singles need to be taught how to prioritize relationships above all else, because God's priorities are relationship with Him and then with others. For single adults, that could mean answering the phone instead of letting it go to voicemail, pursuing time with friends instead of spending lonely nights in their apartments, or working out issues with friends instead of just walking away. When relationships become priority, the journey to marriage becomes far easier. Marriage can also, as we classify it, be put into 3 sort of categories or types. First, there's secular marriage, which tends to focus on selfish fulfillment and what can I get out of it instead of giving or serving. Then there's the typical Christian marriage, which ideally focuses on loving and serving one another while living a godly Christian life. And lastly, we like to talk about a higher form of marriage we call kingdom marriage. That's when a couple marries not just for their own fulfillment, to serve one another or to have children, well, those are good, but a kingdom couple's marriage, they focus on extending God's kingdom, discipling others, and making an impact on the world for Christ. In our ministry, we found when we call singles to this higher standard of marriage, that it changes how they date, it changes what they look for in a marriage partner, and it can also speed up the journey to a lifelong love. We teach singles to develop a selfless lifestyle before marriage, living daily to love others before themselves. So instead of building their lives around entertainment, pleasure, ski trips to Tahoe, or whatever it is, to give more time to serving the widows, the fatherless, others around them. This helps singles create right priorities in preparation for great partner choices in marriage. The church also needs to treat singles as a significant part of the church, not just second-class citizens that just need to get on with their lives. And so we've seen that when pastors include singles in their sermon illustrations or in their church programming, singles start to feel like they belong to a larger family. And when leaders encourage married couples to befriend singles, it's easier for them to thrive. Still fond of the memories of families that invited me over for Christmas, delicious Christmas dinners when I was single, or the older men that took the time to encourage me and help me along the way. Now, this is probably the greatest need of singles. When spiritual mothers, fathers, and mentors take an interest in singles, their love and wisdom can bring great healing and blessing. Also, when other Christian adults model great relationships, or even tactfully and lovingly help them in their relational lives, singles find it easier to make it through the cultural storm. While ministering to singles, we found there is little, if any, training and discipleship that teaches singles how to prepare for marriage and how to date God's way. That's why we wrote a book and we've developed a workshop we call Dating for Keeps. My wife and I, through training and mentoring, have seen hundreds prepared for great relationships or successfully navigate the stormy journey to marriage. We've even set some of them up. These many couples are now enjoying great marriages. We're convinced that when churches provide such training, they'll not only see singles grow and thrive, but they'll see the emotional and spiritual health of their entire congregations improve. In closing, here are a few relational success stories. Among the many dozens we've seen, I've changed some of the names to protect the innocent. First, there's Paul and Jill, who we helped set up after they attended a course. They hadn't even noticed each other, but they agreed to date. At first, they felt there was no chemistry, but after some mentoring over coffee, they realized that they could cultivate this thing. Eventually, a powerful connection and match was ignited, and the couple married with great celebration. Then there was Lonnie, who we helped for years change his avatar so that he stopped seeking a supermodel and instead found a godly model in character. They are now church leaders and have a wonderful kingdom marriage. Finally, there's Keith and Joe, who worked out their fears of lack of ministry compatibility and chemistry. With guidance, they developed a kingdom vision and love that now glues together a great marriage. So to wrap up, my wife and I believe it's going to take the full involvement of the entire church family to stem the tide of unhealthy, prolonged singleness. I want to challenge all of you and your churches to help care for the singles in your midst. And hey, as you do so, even if you're just helping your friends or roommates, you may want to free up your schedule like us to join in on some great celebrations of kingdom marriage. Thank you.
We Mass Media, media empowering community.